Good morning, everyone. It's a delight to be with you, and I want to say thank you to Archdeacon Ruth for her invitation. It's an honor to preside at the Eucharist, but particularly, of course, on Easter Sunday. During this sermon, on more than one occasion, we will say the Easter greeting back and forth to one another. So at some point, I will say, Alleluia, Christ is risen, and I hope you will respond, He has risen indeed. Alleluia. Alleluia, Christ is risen. He has risen indeed. Alleluia. The gospel which we just read from St. Matthew has some rather unusual and at first perhaps slightly odd details in it. But I think those will be pointers about some of the surrounding experiences of that very first Easter, and they may be very helpful for us as we open ourselves to experiencing our Lord's resurrection in our time. So you may notice that the two women, only two in Matthew's Gospel, only two women come to the grave, and you realize they are not coming to experience our Lord's resurrection. They're coming because his death is absolutely certain, and they have certain honorary but difficult customs to perform. So they are going in grief and expecting nothing other than that grief to deepen. Notice also that they're going into danger. There are Roman guards at the tomb because there is a suspicion that people will come and steal the body and then proclaim that Christ has risen, and it will all have been just a trick. So they are going into the presence of the very soldiers that on Good Friday executed Jesus by torture. The women are in grief, they are moving into danger, and when they get there, their world shakes. It's an earthquake, but the deeper meaning is their world is about to be shaken. And notice that they don't experience the risen Jesus. They experience an angel, but not Jesus yet. Very strange. You think that they come to the tomb and the risen Jesus would greet them, but no, it's a message that they are to begin a journey. In those days, quite a long journey, probably 4 or 5 days walk from Jerusalem to Galilee. Galilee is fairly far north of Jerusalem. Why would Jesus tell them to go there? Well, of course, because that's where they're from. But all these details have deeper meanings that relate to us. That's why Matthew put them in. The women are going back to where they really live. You can imagine that there are perhaps implications for us. The experience of the risen Christ is going to happen where we really live. And they go on this long journey, and there they and the men who haven't appeared until this point, they and the men are sent to do the mission work of proclaiming our Lord's resurrection. Then note the one final odd verse at the end of this experience. The odd verse is, we didn't read all of it today, but the odd verse is that they see our Lord and some still doubt it. Why do you think Matthew put that in? Why did he share that detail? He might well have just left it out. But it was important for Matthew, for some reason we'll see in a moment, to draw to our attention that even in the presence of the risen Christ, it's still possible to doubt. It may actually be a good thing, because when your doubts have been met, as they were with Thomas, then that makes you an even stronger disciple and proclaimer of our Lord's resurrection. So having seen those slightly odd experiences of Jesus, we then begin to think, based on Matthew's suggestions, how it is you and I may experience the risen Christ now. Because, of course, if we don't experience the risen Christ ourselves, we're really only talking about something that happened many, many centuries ago, and people in our time will wonder if it really matters. It matters, absolutely. And you and I are the ones who carry that message. So how do we experience our Lord's resurrection now? Well, we experience it in many different ways, and some of them quite ordinary ways in our own lives. So that experience of death and resurrection is something that has happened to many of us in the death of another person. When it's somebody who's very close to you who has died, you experience grief. A number of people very important to me have died, very important. And that grief, sometimes that's been going on many decades, never leaves. That's like the women going to the grave in grief. But grief doesn't remain exactly the same. Over time, grief changes, and we go on a journey of remembering that important person in different ways as the years pass. And in time, simply the memory of that person, while grief is still present, and the danger of getting obsessed by grief is there, that's like the danger with the soldiers that the women encountered. Nevertheless, as we begin to say that there is more happening than this, what we may discover is that there is a new and deeper appreciation, if the death was a long time ago, perhaps of how that person influenced our life. And their risen life becomes part of ours, and maybe something we give deep thanks for. That's a kind of resurrection. There are other kinds, we'll come to them, but that's a resurrection where death and grief and the loss of all possible hope, that is changed into resurrection for us as the value of that person becomes more and more deep for us. That's a kind of resurrection, and it's something for which we give thanks. There are other kinds of resurrections. If you have had children, you know that at some point you have to stop walking them to school and allow them to do at least part of that walk, if the school's close by, on their own. Not when they're not ready for it, but when they are ready to travel on their own. And at that point, I remember well, it's a very painful experience to let the children go. Ours, to our astonishment, went every day happily, and nothing dreadful ever happened. And that's a resurrection in our relationship with our children. One dies to the false need to be with them at every moment. One doesn't die to important and true needs. One makes sure they know what they're doing. But when they do, there comes a point where they have to become their own person. And for them to rise into their adult life means you and I have to die to that need to be with them at every moment. And then the wonderful resurrection happens in our relationship. In time, you discover that you are honored as an equal in the relationship with our adult children. That's a resurrection, which, when it happens, is absolutely wonderful. Something similar happens inside you and I as a resurrection. We all know we are limited people. We all know that we are not completely capable of absolutely everything. We all know that there are weaknesses in us. And for a long time, perhaps starting especially in one's teens, one does one's best to deny all those limitations. They become embarrassing, and we really don't want to be like that. And there comes a time, as we know, when as adults, we have to die to that sense that we're required to do everything perfectly. One comes to the point where one happily laughs at oneself, knowing that lots of what we do is far from perfect. That giving up of the need to be perfect, in other words, to die to some of the illusions about ourselves, that becomes a resurrection. And as we grow into that resurrection, we become more and more clear that we are profoundly loved by God, and God expects us, therefore, to love ourselves. And that only comes through the death of the illusions that had once captivated us. Another unusual in our time, but I think important experience of resurrection is the evolution of life. The way evolution happens is exactly the way our Lord's death and resurrection happens. The way evolution happens is that there are always, in any species of animals or creatures, ones that don't fit because they're odd, because they're not normal. And every once in a while, it's the presence of those odd misfit creatures which gives rise to a whole new kind of animal. It really is quite amazing. It's as if Jesus' death and resurrection is actually what is continuing to create life. It's a wonderful possibility. And finally, perhaps the death that is most filled with grief and worry and anxiety and despair in our time, maybe the grief of what's going on in the wider world right now. I don't know that there's a single radio or television news broadcast when I don't feel hopeless at the end of it, because it looks hopeless. And that's like the grief of the two women arriving this morning at our Lord's grave. They had no hope that they would find a risen Jesus. And we have the same experience in our feeling of oppression, maybe even despair of what's happening in the wider world, both militarily and politically, and also with the climate. And yet, when our Lord rises from the grave, the whole creation is made new. How can that be possible? That's what the woman would have said if somebody had said to them, you're going to experience the risen Jesus. They would say, how is that possible? But it is possible because our Lord has risen, and he is the way in which we see God. And if he has risen from death, that means God has ensured that the whole creation will rise from death. How that will happen, when it will happen, perhaps at the very end of time, but when it happens, that is as certain as our Lord's resurrection. And you and I, listening to those broadcasts which oppress us so much, need to say back to the broadcast and to the message that there's no hope. You know what we say? Alleluia, Christ is risen. I'm sure you're saying he is risen indeed, alleluia, but I hunch you're a little cautious about that. So we need to own that it's true because it is. So let's say it again. And I'm assuming you could say it with even more enthusiasm the second time. Alleluia, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. And that rising of Christ is not simply something that happened 2,000 years ago. In John's Gospel, John says Jesus was right there at the very beginning when all creation was made. That means his death and resurrection were right there at the very beginning. And that's what we claim now. We claim that resurrection. If you're at all like me, it takes a lifetime, more than a lifetime, of course, to really absorb that fact. I certainly need to pray and worship daily, or it will begin to fade in me. I need to reconnect it. Being at a wonderful Easter Eucharist, as we are today, is such an important way. But one of the ways happens every Sunday. Every Sunday is a mini Easter day. Every Sunday is an opportunity to be fed by our Lord's death and resurrection. And of course, that happens in the Eucharist. It looks like just a small piece of bread, a little sip of wine. How can that change everything? But what that bread and wine is saying and doing and being is that the resurrection is happening right now, in our time, in our world, in this universe. And that is something of great joy. So when you take that bread and wine into yourself at the Eucharist today, make sure you say quietly to yourself, well, so as not to disturb everybody else at the Eucharist, you know what you say. Alleluia, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. If you say that quietly to yourself as you receive the bread and wine, it becomes true because it is true. Thanks be to God for the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Alleluia. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.